Another day of the war in Ukraine as Russians continue to advance within the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as the Ukrainians attempt to turn the tide in Vovchansk in the north as well as Krasnoyarivka in the south. This is your host Weep Union, and in this update we start out in the direction of Krasnoyarivka, where we see that the Russians are pushing in the central part of the residential area in the western parts of the city, and the Ukrainians are counterattacking in the south, where they are attempting to regain a foothold in the southern parts of Krasnoyarivka and hit the Russian supply line into the city from the south. There has come out combat footage from the Krasnoyarivka direction, which has been geolocated. First off, we see this image here, which shows Ukrainian soldiers in the southern outskirts of Krasnoyarivka, which were hit by Russian FPV drones. And in this second image, we see a similar scenario where Russian soldiers in the central parts of the western part of the city were hit by Ukrainian FPV drones, which indicates Ukrainian positions in southern Krasnoyarivka and the Russian positions in the northern parts of Krasnoyarivka. Further north here in the direction of Avdiivka, we see three separate Russian advances as is reported by Deep State Map. In the direction of Yevhenivka, the Russians have captured the final parts of the fortified positions and advanced to the forest line east of the final parts of Yevhenivka, which is this desolate area in the south of Vovcha. The Ukrainians have this fortified position, which is the next target of the Russian armed forces in this area. Together with the Russian assault on Vovcha, the southern parts of it by the fortified positions, they are also advancing along the railway and the fortified areas to the east of Prodes, as well as the forest patch east of it, as they attempt to move in the direction of the village. The Russians are here launching assaults both to the north and to the south to connect in a pincer attack the villages of Prodes and Vovcha at the same time, launching a simultaneous attack. Here the Russians are looking to attack the next line of defense of the Ukrainians, which is here along the Vovcha river line, which goes from Prodes in the north and down to Karlivka in the south. The only remaining Ukrainian positions east of this area is Novoselivka Persha and the fortified positions south of Vovcha. In the direction of Novoselivka Persha, the Russians have advanced to the southeast of the town, where they are now advancing towards the southern outskirts. This is to connect the positions of the Russians by Umansk with Novoselivka Persha with the road that has recently been captured by the Russians between the two settlements. At the same time, there are assaults by the Russians from Novopokrovsk from the east and in the northern direction from the fortified positions, as well as assaults towards the Vovcha river line and the Ukrainian fortified positions on the western bank of it. So we're seeing intense Russian offensive operations here in the Avdiivka section of the front line towards Pokrovsk. In the direction of Toretsk here in the southeastern parts by Selizhne, the Russians have expanded their zone of control over their recent offensive operation here in the direction of Selizhne, where they've managed to capture these fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the southern parts of the village. The lines, yellow lines, are all indicating Ukrainian fortified positions, whether they are trenches or concrete fortifications that have been geolocated and mapped out. The Russians capturing these fortified positions secure their positions here in their recent offensive operations, strengthening their pincer attack here from the south, where the Russians are here looking to gain control over the apartment complex area to the north and the school here in the south, which will allow the Russians to use these positions as a springboard for further offensive operations towards the high ground here to the east of Toretsk. The Russians will here be attempting to attack the second line of defense of the Ukrainians and to both of the heights in the area. At the same time, the Russians have recently advanced in the north by Drushba, where their objective is to move along the railway, gain full control over the northern parts of it, secure the canal here to the east of it, which will strengthen the northeastern flank of Toretsk of the Russians, before they move further onwards to the next Ukrainian defensive position, which are the fortified positions here to the northeast of Toretsk, the apartment complex area in the eastern parts of Toretsk, and the high ground positions in the east of Toretsk. So we see that the Ukrainian fortified positions are only in the second and third line of defense that are left, and the Russians, with their offensive operations in the direction of Drushba, have managed to bypass a significant portion of the Ukrainian second line of defense, while the Russians are also attacking head-on the Ukrainian positions from the east. Their main focus is here to the north, where they're looking to bypass second line of defense, widening the front and allowing the Russians to have a better possibility of taking control over the second line of defense and move on to the third line of defense at the same time. The recent Russian advance in the direction of Drushba was reported and released based on geolocated footage of combat footage that was released by Ukrainian soldiers as they hit Russian soldiers with artillery within Drushba. So we see that the Russians are advancing within the eastern parts of Toretsk, but are being hit by Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery as they are in other sections of the front line. In the north, in the direction of Makiivka, the Russians have here managed to expand their zone of control and gain full control over the eastern parts of Makiivka to the north and central parts. The southern parts still has Ukrainian positions on the eastern bank of the Serbets River, which is likely the next target of the Russians, where they've recently advanced to the east of it, which could indicate a push coming from the east, and with the recent control of the northern parts, they'll likely also attack from the north. This will then allow the Russians to pass over and gain control over the western bank of the village as well. We see that the similar case in the direction of Makiivka, where the Russians have captured the eastern bank of the river line, but has not yet entered the western bank. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the eastern bank of the entirety of the Serbets River, which spans from Makiivka in the north and all the way down to Torske in the south. The current operations are taking place on the eastern bank, where the Russians are attacking by Makiivka and attempting to cross over, as they have in the west of Svatove, which is this small part here. And the Russians are also looking at the same time to gain control over the eastern parts of Makiivka, then cross over to gain full control over the town, and move further south towards Nevske, and so on. We have seen a lot of positional fighting east of Terni and Makiivka. However, after months of fighting, the Russians were pushed away from both of these towns, as the Ukrainians have prepared heavily fortified positions and have been using a lot of their forces and available units to hold back the Russian advance, and have successfully defended both of these towns. In the north, in the direction of Vovchansk, the Russians have been pushed back in the western part of the northern part of the town. Here, the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks in a continuous attempt to cut off the supplies to the Russian soldiers by the aggregate plant, who have recently launched a further offensive operation across the Vovcha River line and entered into the southern bank of the Vovcha River line. So we're seeing that the Russians are attempting to cross over and improve their positions by cutting off the Ukrainian forces to the east. The Ukrainians took advantage of that operation to hit the Russian forces in the rear, attempting to cut off the only supply line to and from the aggregate plant, where they've been hitting both flanks over the past few weeks, but recently have managed to capture a part here to the west of it. So there's heavy fighting taking place within Vovchansk from the eastern parts of the town to the western parts of it, and the Russians and the Ukrainians both are launching offensive operations simultaneously, which has led to this positional fighting where both sides are taking territory and losing territory at the same time. The main fighting is taking place here to the southwest of the northern parts of Vovchansk, across the Vovcha River line, by the aggregate plant, in the apartment complex area in the central parts, and in the eastern parts of the town, where it has gone back and forth. The Ukrainians have secured most of the river line here to the east of Vovchansk. However, the Russians still have a foothold here in between Tychy and Vovchansk. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.